Hey there, and welcome to the Dynamics Hot Dish Podcast, serving up stories and knowledge on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. This is What's Hot in Dynamics. You're now joining Merlin Schweiger, Liz McGlennon, and Ashley Steiner.
So I just got my parents to watch Chernobyl like 4 years later. But Liz, yeah. I remember that you said that we had talked about it a long time ago when you started watching it, then I watched it. So I finally got my parents too. Nice. And my dad was, oh gosh, he's going to listen to this. He was like talking through the entire thing. Like he'd be like, oh, like, did you know this? And then I'd be like, okay, in 5 seconds, they're going to show that. Like, so it was just like watching it alone, like, because obviously the story, but my parents lived through it. So
it's a little different.
It is. So it was just so funny, or he would be like, oh, they haven't brought these people up for a while, or how does this end? And I'm like, Dad, like, it's only 5 episodes.
It is a good show.
Yeah.
It was super interesting, I thought. Like, obviously, I was alive, but I wasn't like paying attention to the news. Yes, I saw that laugh, Ashley. Yes, I'm old. They did have electricity when I was born. Wow. But yeah, like I found it like super educational. I was like, oh man, like I had no idea. Oh, I didn't know it was that bad. Oh, I didn't know they did that. It was super interesting.
Yeah, I guess they only dramatized like one part of it too. Like everything else was like really factual or true. There was only one part that they could be like, yeah, this was like dramatized and make it like more interesting. So
yeah.
Which part?
So oh my gosh, this is like, I just watched it, so you guys are gonna like, I have no idea. In episode 2, when like the female scientist comes in and says like, oh, like the water tanks are full and it's gonna explode, they exaggerated how much it would explode to make it more like impactful. Like they made it sound worse to, like, on the show than like it was in real life, just because I don't think us is like, but obviously it was a big deal, but like to a scientist, it makes different sense anyway. So that was the only thing that they could call out that was like super not factual.
That's pretty realistic then, if that's the
that's
only
what my
thing.
dad said. He was like, well, that's really minimal to the story.
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good show.
Yeah.
If anybody hasn't watched it, watch it.
I'd recommend it. I know it's like 4 years old, so I feel like super outdated bringing it up, but I finally watched. It's the enjoyment of watching stuff with your parents. So
it's true.
So speaking of something else that everybody just loves to talk about, and a fun, never-ending, time-old topic: security.
Yay, security!
And I think that security has changed a lot. I mean, especially since I've started, have things like model-driven apps and things like that to help drive your security model. So initial thoughts, or just things that people should know.
Well, it's changed and it's not changed, because those profiles have not changed.
That's true. Like the way
love little pies.
I would say like the way you create it is obviously the same, but like the application of it can be different. It's
fair enough.
Right. I think the underlying security model really has not changed in forever. But the ways in which that you can apply security now, I think you have a lot more choices and options, and a lot of things that you can do now with what I would say is like soft security that you had to do before with like hard security. Like hard security being like, Ashley can see this record, Liz cannot see this record at all in any way, and so we have to give them separate security roles on it. Now I can say, well, Ashley doesn't need to see this record, but it's not a problem if she does. And so I can use soft security to make it so that it's not obvious or easily presented to Ashley, but I don't actually have to actively prevent her from being able to see it.
Right. It's not like there's no like legal or like confidential reason why she can't. Like if she really, really wanted to find that data, it would be okay. It's just more from like a usability and like surfacing what's relevant perspective. Yeah, model-driven apps change that a lot. Like, 'cause we used to have to use security roles to control that to a degree. Or we just couldn't. Like the list of views, you just couldn't change that.
Right. Right. And you could try to like cheat around some things, but you usually had to tie it to a security role so that you could do some JavaScript that checked to see if you had the right role before it showed something or hid something. And now, like with setting up a model-driven app, like you can define your own forms and views and everything that belongs in that app, and just leave everything else out. And it just makes it so much cleaner and so much nicer.
I think it changed everything. The whole model. I know this isn't a model-driven app conversation, but they're so heavily entwined with each other, right? Because you don't have to do the same security. Like,
Yeah.
gosh, I have over 100 security roles in my system because it was pre-model-driven apps, right? And so it's like trying to then apply those to a model-driven app world is a nightmare. Because why do you need over 100?
That's brutal.
Mhm.
Why do you have 100 security roles?
It's a long story.
Okay.
I wasn't there when they built it. It has to do with we have different companies. Obviously, we have different business units, and so they all look at things differently. They all have like a different kind of restriction. Then we have different roles, salesperson, sales manager, VP of sales. They all have different access. And then not only that, in addition to all the business, now I've lost my train of thought. I'll say in addition to all of like the different roles, and we have 2 different integrations into our system, so they could see one set of integration data versus the other.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And so in the past, you would have had to have like a bunch of different business units and security roles and a whole bunch of stuff. And now, theoretically, if the business units operate somewhat similarly, you could have security roles by like salesperson or sales manager or sales VP and have different model-driven apps for each business unit so that business unit A gets their app, but then the roles are essentially the same within that app.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just completely changed the application and how you roll it out to your users. I'll say, so I'll just talk a little bit about what I know about security roles. So it was one of the things that I hated to have to learn in the old system. And I also didn't realize that like, if I change it, like it meant different things. And that's probably just like one of those young, you're 22, 23 years old, not really paying attention. But I didn't realize that the pies meant different things. Like, I'm just going to make this one a half a pie.
There's a key on the bottom.
I know there's a key, but like, when you're like just learning the system, you don't know what parent-child business, you know what I mean? Like, you don't understand that relationship. So you're like, sure, that sounds good. And so it's a lot of trial and error.
It also only applies if you actually have business units deployed. Like if you're not using business units, those levels are irrelevant.
Right. Agreed. But when you're just learning the system, sometimes you don't know those things. So I'll say that like that's a learning curve. But also I was always taught when you wanted to create a new security role and make an adjustment, don't change the Microsoft given security roles, just copy them and create a new one with any sort of additional data that you need on it, just in case Microsoft makes any changes to their security. And I've always been told like you have to copy them because there's something hidden deep in the security role that you can't replicate. But I've actually found a lot of use cases for building a brand new security role not copied, because maybe you have like a customer service agent, and then like tier 2 has this additional access, and so you just use the base role and then you build on top of it. So you
should copy it if it's its core, like the base role. But if it's a role that you're stacking and that just adds like one more privilege, that's fine, because you would never want to create a role from scratch if that's the only role you're giving that user.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Right.
Then you will run into problems.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think
that's what it is. But go ahead, Mary.
I think that's a good guideline is in general, like I think the perception of security roles in the past has generally been you apply like a baseline role that essentially everybody gets, and that's probably a copy of one of the like pretty basic Microsoft provided roles, and that's like your baseline. That gives you access to the system and like accounts and contacts or something. And then you start layering your roles on top of that based on your job role and the security that you need there. And I think a thing to keep in mind is that dynamic security, unlike Microsoft Active Directory security, is additive as opposed to the opposite of additive. subtractive, I don't actually know, where if you have a permission in any one role, then you have that permission. Whereas like Active Directory is sort of backwards. If you deny somebody something somewhere, then they are denied that thing. And so it's a lot easier to sort of do that layering. And so kind of live to your point of it's okay to just do one permission in one role. If that's really the only thing you need in that security role, that's totally fine. Just make that one permission. That one permission now could be just access to a specific model-driven app. And there might be no other access granted by that role. But if you want to get this app, then here's the role to get the app.
So that leads me to like a question I've been wondering with model-driven apps. Like if the best practice was to kind of have a base role and then you stack them based on how many, like what permission level you need, and to not necessarily make it like job title or role specific unless they needed different access to the system. But with model-driven apps, like do you change that approach and do you go more to like a role-based approach, assuming that you have multiple model-driven apps deployed? Or Merlin, you brought up, like, do you have a role that's just access to the app? What do you guys think?
Well, I can tell you what I do. I don't know what I would do if I was like starting over, but I have just a security role for a specific app. So if you need, because we have two apps that we use between our sales teams. So you either get this security role or you get this one because they actually share the same base salesperson security role. Now would I do it differently if I started over? I don't know. I kind of like that there's one base salesperson role. Everybody, it's the same. And then depending on which app you're using, you might have an added security on top.
Yeah, because your other alternative would be to have two base roles to separate via the apps, but then
you have to manage two security roles.
Right. And like if it's just access to the app, that's different. Like what's the point of that, adding that complexity or that extra maintenance?
I agree. Especially because we have different levels of salespeople. We have some salespeople that can only see their stuff versus salespeople that can see their teams. Then we have sales, you know what I mean? So it's like that would be 2 for each of those different levels of what kind of salesperson you are.
Yeah, potentially. I guess I see your point, Liz. You could consider, instead of a singular base role for the entire platform, you could have a base role per model app. And I guess I could also see then that might add complexity, Ashley, to your point. If you then needed to apply, then you're sort of building a hierarchy of security roles per app instead of, per business unit or whatever, you're still ending up in that same sort of like super complex, like too many roles situation.
But I think that only works if the base role can be the same between all the model-driven apps. So if like they're using their apps differently, or if like, hey, this sales team works this way and this one, it's inside sales versus national sales, they might need different kinds of base security. And so then, and they might have 2 different apps, and then I could see that being applicable. So I think it really just depends on how you set up your system.
Yeah, that's true.
And what the business requirements are for security too.
Right. And I would say the other advice that I have for security is don't just automatically assign security based on your company hierarchy. Assign it based on what they need access to.
Yeah. It's not copying your org chart.
No. Same with business units. I know that that's not really, I would consider that a part of security though, because you're kind of separating data. Don't ever just copy your company hierarchy as your business units.
And you don't necessarily need business units either. Like if you don't have any hard and fast, like we have to keep this data completely separate, like for like silo teams, and it's just a UI preference thing, just do a model-driven app. Like you don't need business units just from a usability perspective. Like they should only be deployed if you really are concerned about it from a security perspective, and like this user can never have a way to access this set of data.
Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of times businesses don't need them deployed.
Yeah, they're more hard security than soft security. And that's, I think, the biggest shift that model-driven apps has brought with security is you used to have to use business units if you wanted either soft or hard security, and now you really only need them if you need actual hard security. It's a good point.
So we were talking about business units, and I guess I have some gotchas around that and just security roles in general. And so one thing to note is that a security role can be assigned to a specific business unit, but also if you're ever moving users from one business unit to another, because of that relationship, it clears out their security roles. So I know I definitely learned that the hard way the first time. It was like, when people couldn't access the system, and I'm like, oh, your security roles are gone because I changed business units, or moved the users to different business units. So that's just a little gotcha to make sure that you're aware of that if you're ever reassigning business units.
Yeah, and I'd say something else too, talking about data and like restricting it, is access teams. So I know that those have been around a while, but I don't think that they are used as well as they should be. So rather than creating like multiple fields of ownership, if you have like a sales team that works on an account, use an access team, and that can also restrict your data.
How about teams in general? Like teams can also have security roles and they can also stack. And so that's just something to remember too. Like if you're ever troubleshooting or trying to figure out like why does this person have this permission? Like check the teams they're on and check the security roles that are applied to the team. Because if you are using teams, like that can definitely be an area that's easy to forget about or overlook.
It's true. And if you're designing your security model and applying security roles directly to users and also to teams and putting new users in teams, I would recommend documenting that well for future people who are coming in so that they remember to look at that, because it can become quite cumbersome to wander around in the system and be like, why does this person see this thing that they should not be able to see?
Mm-hmm. So my two other kind of tricks or gotchas with working with security roles is, the first one is that custom entities always default to no permissions and they go on that like end tab. And so not forgetting about handing out the right permissions to all of your custom entities. And then I guess something I learned early on, but wish I knew sooner, was just how you can toggle the whole, I should say table, all the tables or the like permissions by just like clicking on the column or row label, and you don't have to like click in each circle one at a time. I know if I would have learned that maybe like a year sooner, I would have saved a lot of time like clicking on all those individual circles to set up security roles.
I think, Merlin, you touched on something really good there, is document like what people have access to. I will say when I started out, I used to print the security and then like mark it up and see how I was going to change it. It's a lot easier to change it or like see what people have that they shouldn't if you document it somewhere, document it well. Like they should have this, but not this. And then you can just go check that within the security role. But yeah, I used to print them and like draw my own little half circles and stuff.
Okay, that might be,
you're a dork.
A bit much.
I'm such a dork. But like that was the only way for me to like visually see it, like I have to write it down.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say like, I'm not saying you have to document like, okay, a salesperson gets read access to these entities, but just like at a high level, like what's your security strategy? Like
Agreed.
We are giving people security roles directly to give them access to these job functions, but this like national accounts sales team gets special stuff. So we've applied a security role to a team and we put them all in a team, just so that it's like a little bit more obvious for anybody else coming in after the fact to be like, okay, so like the strategy is most users get this, but some users get that. Or we've given everybody just security is only based on team membership and we're not applying any security roles to user records at all. Fine, if that's the way you want to do it, go nuts. But just make sure that it's like noted somewhere what your overall strategy is.
And I'd say think about it before, like when you're starting a project.
That was like my next question, was when do you work on security in the project?
So I would say, so when I work on a project, I do not actually apply the security until the end, but I am thinking about it and documenting kind of like those high level notes the entire time. Especially if you're bringing something new in. So let's say you have an established security. How is that new thing that you're bringing in going to impact your existing security? Do you want to update your base security, or is this going to be just another level that you put in? Or if you're working with different teams and you're building something new, They might need different access to it, or like this sales team might need it, but this salesperson doesn't. So does that mean that that's at a point where you break up your model driven apps because they're starting to become too different? You know, it's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. I think in general, thinking about security from the beginning is a good idea when you're doing any sort of software development or deployment. The internet is full of examples of companies who thought about security at the end and managed to expose millions of users of data or lose stuff or whatever. But yes, think about security the whole way. It's a good idea.
Awesome. Any last thoughts on security?
I don't know, it's super fun. And
I'd say
I have one. Test
ahead,
with
Marla.
the security role. Don't test as an admin. I see that happen so much where they're like, oh, we did testing, but they didn't test with the right security role. And it's like, no, that doesn't count. Like that can't be your last test before go live.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say that too, like making sure that you have test users available to assign and play around, moving them into different business units, even like what can you see, what can you not, if you do have business units, you know, access to or from the model driven apps. But, you know, Merlin, it's so funny that you say like, oh, it's so fun, but it's like one of those necessary things. Like you have to consider it in every project that you do, regardless of what kind of change you're making to the system. Security is going to come up. I mean, we didn't even touch on things like the field security level profiles, like you can even lock down fields if necessary. So you really have to consider all of that when you're deploying something new.
Yeah, it's true. I guess my last piece of advice is when you're starting, use a whiteboard or paper or whatever. It makes it a lot easier to just like map out where all the different users sit, how they actually need to interact with the data, and helps you get your head around it before you actually start clicking all those tiny little pie circles.
It's a good tip.
Agreed. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Dynamics Hot Dish podcast. For additional content and previous episodes, check out our website at dynamicshotdish.com, follow us on Twitter at dynamicshotdish, and subscribe to our podcast for notifications. Thanks. See you next time.